Today, I want to speak on the topic of knowing thyself, a topic I have spoke on much, and a topic that all the great philosophers have encountered. Socrates' core of his philosophy was around the unexamined life is not worth living. And he would have been encountered with this phrase when he entered the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, for it's inscribed on the entrance, know thyself. And I think I think the fool and the wise man can understand what it means to know thyself. But I think the man in the middle, who's no longer a fool but no longer wise, I believe he overthinks what know thyself means. I believe I'm not wise. Maybe I just became a fool again, but for a long time I was in this middle ground where I was trying to become well read in many areas of Western and Eastern thought. And some people come to the conclusion that you know oh, the Western tradition was so on point with know thyself because the Eastern tradition was right there too. And the Eastern tradition came up with that there is no self, where the Western tradition really never came up with an answer. So people really think that know thyself is there is no self. And I think that's a superficial, bad understanding. I don't think it's right. I don't think it does due diligence to either Western thought or Eastern thought to take a Western question and pose a Eastern answer. Now, there is value to the idea of having no self because it can help you have an ego death, and realize that you're not your name, you're not your possessions, you're not these things. But at the end of the day, it's not as practical as really coming to grasp with knowing thyself as it would be if you examined it in the way that Socrates, I believe, meant for it to be examined. Aristotle talks about how virtue is the mean of two vices. And for instance, courage is in between cowardice and rashness. And I think what it means to know thyself is to know your natural disposition, to know which way you lean. If you're naturally more of a coward, or if you're naturally more rash and impulsive. And I think this is this is brought to light in a great way with an Eastern teacher. And yes, I will go to Eastern philosophy, even though I just said, a Western question shouldn't be answered by Eastern philosophy. But philosophy, doesn't discriminate. Um, but that's beside the point. I think you know what I meant, and I think you understand what I'm about to say. Confucius was once called out on a contradiction. One of his students said, you know, this isn't right. You told me to be, to be impulsive. You told me to go, to not think. But I think it's like his name was you told Yu Ran to be patient, to, or no, it's the other way around. He told him to be patient. He told Yu Ran to be impulsive and to just go for it. And he asked, how can this be true, Confucius? And Confucius says, Yu Ran he overthinks. You know, he has, a modern term, he gives into paralysis through analysis. He thinks too much and it gives him paralysis. So he needs advice to be impulsive, to be go, go, go. Don't think so much, just do. But you, on the other hand, he says, you are too impulsive. You are too rash. You needed the advice to be patient. And this is beautiful because they both have natural disposition. One towards, you know, one side, the other towards the other. So they both need different advice to get them to the mean. They both need the opposite advice to get them to the mean. And that's Confucius is a great teacher for understanding this, and a great teacher for knowing his students so well to be able to give contradictory advice to two of them to get them to the same position. Because wisdom is not black and white, because no human is the same. No two people need the same advice because everyone's natural disposition is different. Some people need to be told to be patient, to calm down, and other people need to be told to, be impulsive, to, get fired up. You're too, you know, you're too patient. Your analysis is leading to paralysis. You don't need more of it. You've done enough of it. It's time to go. Learn through experience. And then, the other person, you've done too much learning through experience. You need to stop, you need to reflect, and you need to think about what you've learned, because you're falling into the same pitfalls from not taking an extra, day to think through things. You're setting yourself back 10 steps when, if you just didn't take a step, you would have advanced 10 steps. And to me, that's what it means to know thyself, to know thy natural disposition towards things, to know where we fall on the metric, the scale of this vice and this virtue, or of two vices, to know where we need to implement what, to know what advice is actually helping us. Because, in this day and age, there's a lot of unsolicited advice. There's a lot of and unsolicited and regular advice that we ask for. But when someone appeals to your natural disposition out of knowledge or not knowing, you need to be weary of it. I think what comes to mind is, in this day and age, there's been much talk on how, girls don't like to be, catcalled, or they don't like to be approached by guys in, certain places, and they don't like to be hit on, and they don't like these things. And, this all stemmed out of a noble place, out of, girls, being raped and not wanting to be, every time they go out in public, talked to by guys and hit on, and they just feel, want to go out and have fun and feel safe, or, you know, it came from a noble place. But the thing that people did not understand, and still do not understand, is that the only people to hear, the only people that will take that message and listen, are the people who have a natural disposition to shyness, are the people that the girls are not talking about. They are the people that are already struggling with confidence to go up to girls. They are the people who are already struggling with, you know, appearance issues and things of that nature. And they'll have like a feeling in their gut, it's like, it feels wrong, it's just like, I don't like, going into their place, when they're comfortable and having fun and, trying to hit on them, it feels weird. I want it to be more natural. And, they're wrestling with this. And then the girls speak, and they say, yes, we don't like this, actually. It sucks. Like, don't do this to us. And then the shy guy says, I knew it. I knew they didn't like this stuff. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to make them feel uncomfortable. I'm not going to be that person. And the person who the advice was tailored to, the person who is too confident, the person who is always hitting on girls, is the person who will see that and say, yeah, right. Like, girls don't know what they want. They only say this because, you know, ugly guys with no confidence are approaching them. I'm not ugly. I have confidence, and they always love when I go and talk to them. So they're clearly not talking about me. They're clearly talking, they just don't want ugly guys to approach them anymore. And, you know, they don't even know what they want at the end of the day. That's what the person who should maybe hear the advice will say. But that's the person who is not going to listen to the advice. And because they have the natural disposition to not listen to that advice, to think, there's already all these barriers with trying to pick up girls. This is just another one that I have to overcome. And, that's how I think, for many reasons, but I think that's how you can get to a culture where you have a whole generation of women who think that there's, they'll say there's no good men left, and, chivalry is dead, and it's your fault. It's not necessarily, if you're a girl watching this, or any girl in general, it's not necessarily your fault, but it's the whole idea the whole movement that your generation and girls as a whole push forward onto people, that we don't want these things. We want to be self-sufficient. We don't want these things. And then you get the chivalrous men, the men of high moral standards. You get them second guessing themselves. Oh, I want to respect this woman. Should I open a door? Should I go in front of her and hold the door open for her? Should I open the door in the car for her? Should I offer to drive because it's traditional? Or is that going to make her feel uncomfortable, like I think I'm better than her? Like, and that's how you get an age where a lot of women will say chivalry is dead. There's no good men left, and that's because you pushed a narrative to push all quote unquote good men away, and the only people who dare approach you are the people you were trying to get to stop approach you because of the message that you pushed. And this isn't a video to rant about that, definitely not, but it's just an example that I've seen in the modern world where people don't know themselves. They don't know that the unsolicited advice that a mass group brought to them was not right because it didn't tailor to it tailored too much to their natural disposition when it needed to do the opposite. It needed to be the other way because they already have that natural tendency to lean that way. And this just comes from people not knowing themselves enough and accepting advice, unsolicited advice. And it's so much easier when you hear advice that tailors to your natural disposition to say, "Yes, I knew it." Because we want to turn our vices into virtues. Why would you not want to turn your vice into a virtue? On a, feeling thing. Many of I think Seneca, even Epictetus, I think says it. I think both say it. The one good thing about your vices is the shame that you feel for them. But when you get to a place where people are appealing to your natural disposition, you lose the shame for your vices. You say, yes, I knew it. I knew this was a virtue all along, but something inside of me was telling me it wasn't, and society kind of was telling me it wasn't, but now this new movement's telling me it is. That was one of the objections that Seneca had for Epicureanism, because Seneca believed Epicurus was a great philosopher who teachings were misunderstood, but he would critique many of the Epicurean successors because he would I wasn't around back then, but he proclaimed that they hung to Epicurean philosophy because they heard that pleasure was a virtue. And then they would say, see, my pleasure is a virtue. I'm living the good life. And they would lose the one good thing they had for their vices, which was shame. And that's because their natural disposition got appealed to. Now, that's why we need to be wary of the advice we take and realize that we have a natural disposition. And we have to know that's what knowing thyself does. It helps us know, okay, I have a problem with, binge eating. I need to, like, when does this come? Oh, it comes when, I start watching movies at night, and then, I have sweets before it, and then I have popcorn, which just like opens up this like eating like subconscious motion. And, that's when I start eating too much, and that's when I fall into this loop. And it's like, okay, know thyself. Know that you need to not do one of those activities or all of those activities to stop that from happening. Oh, I have a natural tendency towards making excuses for my laziness. Okay, how do you get around that? Well, maybe make it more convenient to be disciplined. Like have my gym clothes in the car after work so I don't have to say, oh, like I was gonna go, but then I had to drive past the gym to get home to get my clothes. And then by that point, I already would have been into my workout. And then, I got home and then the dogs wanted to see me. And then before I knew it, it was dinner time. And then, blah, 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 and then, you just can make this excuse. But if you know you have a disposition to do that, set yourself up for success. That's really the idea of knowing thyself, is setting yourself up for success, realizing that there's this natural disposition that you just naturally have that you're going to have to combat. And it might be sloth, it may be greed, um, any of the vices, because that's the thing, virtue is in the middle of two vices. I think Aristotle was on point when he claimed that, because it's clear, it's clear because too much courage just leads to an Achilles where he dies. I don't think Achilles is, for all the, chills he may give you, all the aura farming that he may do, he was not the hero of Troy. Hector is the hero of Troy, the man who is humble, who is disciplined, who is on the battlefield day in and day out, fighting to defend his country. And Achilles is the lustful, fame seeking warrior who falls in love with a slave girl, who doesn't show up to the battlefield, who only returns because his cousin's been killed, and then kills Hector and drags him by horse back to camp, refusing Troy to bury their hero. And you know, Achilles isn't the hero of Troy. Hector is the hero of Troy. And because he had the mean of the vice, he was the mean of courage. He wasn't too rash. Achilles was too rash. He wasn't too lustful. Achilles was too lustful. He wasn't too greedy for fame. Achilles was too greedy for fame. He was told, don't go and you'll live out your days happily, or go and no one, and your name will be remembered forever. And he goes. He wanted his name to be forever. He wanted posthumous fame. And I mean, he got it. But, at what cost? We still remember Hector. And Hector didn't sacrifice anything for for virtue. Virtue was in and of itself the reward for Hector. And we still remember both of them. But that's just the mean, As I said, Aristotle was on point with his evaluation of the means of two virtues. And as the whole point is knowing thyself and knowing your natural dispositions and not thinking too deep into it. I got into a point at one point where I just gave up on knowing thyself, not in the terms that I'm talking about, but in the terms of truly thinking about it, because I thought, oh, well, there is no self. The Eastern philosophers have figured it out. But that's just so not true. Yes, if you lose your memory, those things you say are yourself may no longer be there, but there's still something there. And who's to say that yourself didn't change? Who's to say that yourself is not malleable? I mean, I believe it is. And when you have brain damage, of course your self is going to be changed. But that doesn't mean you have no self. I mean, yeah, you're clearly not a name. You're clearly not this desire. But who's to say that your actions are not yourself? Who's to say you are not the things that you do? You know, it's I don't I don't think we should place much weight in what people say they believe. We should place weight in their actions, because that's how you truly see what they believe. One may say he is kind, but if he never gives you a reason to think he's kind, is he really kind? One may say that he's chaste, but if he's, a man whore or whatever, are you really going to believe him? Actions speak louder than words, and actions are how you know your true self. And your self is changeable because your actions are changeable. And you can develop these virtues, and you make yourself virtuous through action. As Aristotle also said, virtue is a verb. And our actions are how we figure out ourselves. And we are our actions. We are not our actions in and of up to this point, because we can change. We have the option in this present moment to be different than who we were. We have this option to change ourselves. But we do have a stack of undeniable truth that of our natural dispositions, of what we have done, of who we may be, of the self that we may naturally have. It's hard to know thyself, but there is not no self. I think that's a foolish thing. And I think also, I mean, the Eastern tradition is great. It's brought many great people, and Confucius, as I spoke on in this, and the Buddha, and Lao Tzu, and you know, um, Su, the Art of War guy, um, Lao Tzu. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. Um, but at the end of the day, these people were monks. These people, not all of them, but it's more of a internal solitude place that you get to, a place of no action. And do you think it's weird? Do you think it's interesting that the philosophy of no action came to the conclusion that there is no self? When action develops yourself, if you do not act, you have no self. Food for thought. But the philosophy that preaches, the Western philosophy, which preaches, I mean, entrance into political life because it's the right thing to do. The giants of Western philosophy were, you know, either politicians or spoke on political matters. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. All these men were political or spoke on political ways. All the great philosophers in the Western tradition were in the world. They were not cooped up in a castle somewhere, other than maybe Montaigne. But um, even he was in politics. I think he was a lawyer and a politician for, like the former half of his life, his adult life. And then he realized how trivial it all was, and he devoted himself to intellectual academic. And even then, he didn't retreat from society. He was still in society. He just wasn't, you know, in political life or working because, he was financially free. But yeah, it's just some food for thought. The no action philosophy came up with the no self, but I mean, the Western tradition is a tradition of action, and I think maybe you can see how we are our actions. It's like you are what you eat. You can say you eat healthy, but if you don't eat healthy, I mean, the body keeps the score. And the whole point of this video is to urge you to miss the pitfall that I missed in going into thinking that there is no self and it's not worth looking into any deeper, because there is a self and we have natural dispositions towards things. And to know these things is so powerful. And the unexamined life is truly not worth living, as Socrates says. And don't get in this illusion that there is no self, that you have no natural dispositions, because it's not true. We all know that it's not true. Know thyself.